Many of you paranormal enthusiasts may have already heard by the word Nahul. No mistaking with Nahul, which is a native people here in Mexico, and I would guess that on also some other countries in Latin America. We call that way to people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, it was a cold night. I remember because it was really odd around that zone of the country. My parents' house is in a small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses on the outsides of town, so not many neighbours, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard, where we used to have sheep, and on one side, a small water stream, and trees to the side. Suddenly, the sheep started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on the window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and smoothing his voice, he told to my mom, "Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." There were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell what he saw. In the barnyard we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were heaped just in one corner. At the centre, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense. But he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one of the sheep there. The one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep inside of the house and keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air, mal air in Spanish. So he made some kind of prayer, holding his machete. On his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. They went outside. My grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Go away, you have nothing to do here, leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, like eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and rise its head up towards my family. This being was only staring at them, not a single noise, also not red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock he picked up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but apparently this being was not that strong. Or maybe because on our side were 6 men armed with machetes, but when the rock hit it, this being turned his back and ran away into the forest, running on 4 legs like an animal would do. This was when they came closer to the sheep. They saw how the sheep on the ground was still alive, but completely unskinned. It was horrifying to say the least. My grandfather sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend who was known for being quite an old man, but still working on heavy farm labour, even heavier than young men, and that used to practice sorcery to heal people, told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a Nahul. He told us he'd spoken to the man and asked him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar like that. I want to share this experience that happened to me around 15 years ago, when I started studying in a town away from my parents' home. There was one man, let's call him Tony, who was a good friend of my father. He helped him at work sometimes, hence I hanged out with them usually. When I was 17, I moved to a bigger city to start university, so I travelled every 2 months to visit my parents for long weekends or vacations. After my second year away, this friend, Tony, died from alcohol abuse. My father told me on a phone call how that happened, or at least how he heard it happened. Around 2 months later, on Dia de Muertos, Day of the Death here in Mexico, I went to visit my parents, also to go and visit the tombs of the family as the tradition goes. And at this point, I literally forgot about Tony's death. The apparition comes around because I didn't catch the bus that arrives during the day to my parents' hometown, so I was forced to take one that arrives there at like 2 a.m. It's quite a small town, so since I didn't find any taxi near the bus station, I decided to walk home. Around 5 blocks away from the house, I had to pass on a bridge where people say that a decapitated donkey spirit scares people during the night. I was a bit scared, to be honest. But then, suddenly this friend, Tony, reached me on his bike. I didn't mention that he always moved on a bike, and asked me if I was just arriving from university. Maybe because I was originally thinking about the decapitated donkey, I completely forgot about the fact that Tony was supposed to be dead. So I started to talk to him, I only walked passing the bridge and a couple more blocks for around 4 or 5 minutes, talking about the school, the food in the other cities, stuff like that. Just 1 block away from my parents' house, he just told me, okay, I have to check some things over here, pointing in another direction. But keep safe, say hello to your father for me. We said goodbye and then I got home. Since it was early morning, I walked directly into my room and waited until the next day to go and see my parents. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was just about to tell my father about Tony, that I remembered that he was already dead. At that moment I didn't tell my parents, but a bit later in the day my father told me he saw me arriving. He asked me if I was drunk or something because he saw me talking to nobody. So then I told him. I think it was some kind of company on that bridge that I was afraid of because of the stories, and also because of that scare from the donkey story. I didn't even pay attention to the fact that my company was someone I knew was already dead. It is kind of funny for me, and actually never felt afraid in the moment. So thanks to that old friend that was there with me, even after death. I suddenly awoke in the middle of the night and there was a face with huge black eyes right in front of mine. I definitely didn't look human, and it didn't show any expression, almost mask-like. It also seemed to look at me at the same time, past me. It's kind of hard to describe. Because it was extremely dark, I tried to rationalize that what I was seeing must be my friend's cat. I remember that she once told me that a cat would often stare very closely at her face when she's hungry and wants food. I thought the huge eyes were simply the cat's face being too close to mine. Because I wanted it to move away from my face, I started to stroke it, just like I would do to a cat, and said Fiora, which is the name of my friend's cat. I could feel my hand touching it, but instead of fur, it felt like I was touching a person's skin. That's when I started to realize something wasn't right. My friend, who tends to wake from the slightest bit of noise and who thankfully happened to be awake at that same time, replied, Fiora isn't here. The thing's face moved away from mine and I realized that the eyes remained big. I sat up abruptly and became scared as I noticed that it wasn't my friend's cat. I then saw it move behind my friend's head and on top of a pillow. I told her to look at her pillow, still hoping that my mind is playing tricks on me and that it's just the cat. My friend sat up, stared at her pillow. I can still see that thing sitting there, but she didn't see anything. I started to panic and asked her to quickly switch on the light, but that's when the thing disappeared. I insisted that we look around the room. The doors and windows were closed, so nothing could have entered or left the room, but I firmly wanted to hold on to the belief that it must have been the cat. We obviously found nothing, and my friend began to worry, as I was really panicking at that point. I tried to process what happened, and was so confused by the fact that I was stroking someone moments ago. Sleep paralysis usually means being unable to move, and feeling the sensation of being touched, or having some weight on top of you, but this was the opposite. I could move freely, didn't feel any pressure on top of me, but I could touch the thing, and it felt like it was physically there. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Edit. I want to further describe the appearance of this thing, as many of you have asked what it looked like. It's really hard to describe, but I'll try my best. The face was a bit smaller than that of an average adult human head. The eyes were about 6 centimeters in height and a bit longer in width. I described them as black, but they also had a thin dark grey iris, about 3 millimeters in diameter, and large pupils. The eyes were slightly popping out of its head. It had a very small mouth, no hair on its head and no ears. The skin was a muddy greyish colour and also covered with a few brown stripes. Once it moved to my friend's pillow, I saw that it didn't have a neck, but a thin body that was only about 1 meter long. The body itself had a pitch black colour, and it walked on 4 legs. A couple of weeks ago, I had a dream in which I was back at my parents' house and somebody knocked on the door. My grandpa, who's long gone for at least 10 years, went to get it, opened it, stood there, asked something that sounded like drum, and then suddenly, like in a freaking jump scene, a woman appeared right in front of me. Tall, pale, long black hair, dead eyes, an inch away from my face, and that's when I woke up. What's even weirder, this dream happened 2 more times, to the point where I was able to recognize what my granddad said, and it was something along the lines of Daruma. I then googled it and I was creeped out when I found out about Daruma Samgakuranda, a Japanese game for kids, which is basically a hide and seek, but instead of seeking for your friends, you hide and a summoned ghost is looking for you. creepiest thing about it is that neither me nor my granddad had anything to do with Japan. I've never heard or read about this subject before. But it gets worse. A week or so later, after the third and so far last episode, I've experienced something that I've later googled as night terror. I was sleeping and I woke up unexpectedly, feeling like somebody's arms were wrapping around my torso and arms and not letting go of me. I also felt like drowning and coughing, and the aforementioned kids game is also associated with falling, drowning, and also called a bathtub game. I jumped out of bed and only then I stopped feeling it. Up until that point, it felt so real, it's impossible to describe and for my brain to comprehend. I still can't believe how real and creepy that felt, but it gets even worse. The reason I decided to write this post is that while undressing for the shower today, I've noticed 3 scratches on my right forearm. I don't recall hurting myself, banging on anything, or scratching against anything, and it only started hurting when I noticed it. I've always believed in the paranormal, in UFOs, possessions, etc., but I also never thought something as random as this would happen, like why something I've never ever heard of appears in my dreams several times, and then the extremely real night terror that happened a few days later is connected to it. I was babysitting my nephew, who at the time was 1.5 years old, a very active kid. You can't lose sight of him or you'll find him stuck in the oven. It was 3 in the afternoon and he always takes a little nap at that time, so I left him in his bed and closed the door. I went to the bathroom and when I came out I noted that the door was open, and I thought that he'd already woke up and he was making a mess in the living room. I called him and he answered me from the kitchen. I ran there and he was standing over the dining table. It's an old square wooden table, about 85 centimeters high, and my nephew was easily a few inches shorter. There were only 4 wooden chairs and they were turned over on the table. I put them that way to prevent him from using them to get on there. The chairs are heavy, even for me it's a bit difficult to put them like that. If he tried to move them alone, they could fall on top of him and hurt him. There is no way that he can move that chair alone without them falling on him, or the chairs falling to the floor, and there's no chance that he would get on the table by himself. But there he was, standing in the middle of the table, with the 4 chairs turned over around him as I had left them. He wasn't even scared, he just saw me and told me, "Totti, Totti." I asked him how he got up the table. I carried him and he kept saying, "Totti, Totti." I thought for a moment that this was some toy that he was looking for, and then I asked him, "What's Totti? Where is Totti?" And he turned and points to a corner in the kitchen, where there was no one or anything. I froze for a moment, and the first thing I thought was, is there someone in the house? Someone broke in and I put him on the table? No way, that doesn't make any sense. But either way, I grabbed my nephew, I took him to his room again, I checked the kitchen, the living room, the rooms, and nothing. There was no one in the whole house, besides us 2. I didn't want to think about the situation anymore. I just felt relieved that my nephew was fine, that he hadn't hurt himself in his little mischief. But I kept wondering, how did he get on that table? When my sister came, I asked her which toy he called Totti, and she told me that it's not a toy, that apparently was some imaginary friend that my nephew had, and that he'd been talking and playing for a week with him. I honestly hadn't planned to tell him what happened. I didn't want to get into trouble with her. I knew she would blame me and accuse me of leaving my nephew alone. But when she told me what it was, Totti, I told her everything. I didn't want to rush to think that it was something paranormal. I just told her how weird the whole situation has been, and she just told me, "You know how Joe's way is. He managed somehow to find a way to get on the table. That's why I always ask you to keep an eye on him. He might have hurt himself." And I thought, okay, she was right. I kept taking care of him, but I was starting to get a little nervous because I always saw and heard him playing with Totti. And one day I got a lot of courage and I asked him, "Where's Totti?" And he takes my hand, leads me to the kitchen and points to the same corner that he pointed out before. I freaked out for a moment, did my best to keep myself together, and later that day I waited for my sister and asked my nephew the same question, and he did the same thing, took me to the kitchen and kept pointing to the same place. For me, that wasn't normal. That was really creepy, to be honest. But my sister told me to just stop asking him about Totti, that if I keep doing it, I only feed his fantasy, and that it wasn't good for him. So I just did what she told me, and I never asked about it again. After that, I started to have this weird feeling that someone else was there with us, but I just ended up ignoring the situation. I didn't want to suggest it to myself, so I took my sister's attitude and didn't think about it anymore. I convinced myself that it was nothing paranormal, it was just a child's imagination. He kept playing with Totti for a while longer until he grew up and didn't mention him again. That was about 2 years ago, and every time I remember that, I still wonder who was Totty and how he got on the table by himself. The doorbell rang after 1:30 a.m. The movie The Vikings with Tony Curtis and Kirk Douglas was on downstairs, music blaring, while my mum was busying herself around. She was always a night owl, but this night she was up until my dad got home. They'd fought earlier, and he went out for the night with business associates. She was supposed to accompany him, but refused, so we went alone. I had just returned from looking for him. He'd called just before 1 a.m. He thought it was my mom. He asked me to pick him up. I could tell he'd been drinking. "Stay where you are, Dad. I'm on my way." At 1:06 a.m., just as I'm walking out the door, he calls again. I'll be walking and waving my arms. He slurred on repeat. "No, Dad, stay where you are. I'm leaving now." When I got there, I couldn't find him. Every time I tried, I was pushed back by the blast of late December air. But there was a car turned the wrong way on the dark, rural 2-lane road with a rumpled up hood and the windshield busted out. Wow, I thought. They must have hit a deer. No cops yet, no ambulance. I got there before they did. I opened our front door shortly after I got home to a police officer and a minister. I'll never forget till the day I die the minister. His dark skin set off by his large, compassionate dark eyes that stared right into me, afraid for me, reaching out to me, knowing he was about to change my life. The officer asked me if my mother was home. Yes, I answered. If this is about my dad, I was just looking for him, I said with a casual, almost friendly tone to hide my apprehension. "We need to speak to your mother," was the officer's cut response. His "just the facts, ma'am" demeanour was more than matched by the compassion the minister gave me just by his full-on, profound stare. While I was hanging up my coat, I heard the minister tell my mom, "There's been an accident, and your husband's killed. He died at 1:11 a.m. Dad and Mom were 40. I was 19, home from school. It was just after Christmas." My siblings were younger and all still in school. The rest of the night was a whirl of hospital identify the body visits, the priest, phone calls, drives to the place he died and back again, and sitting around in disbelief. What do we do now? He was the most powerful man in the world. He was gone. We were adrift. It was a long time before I could sleep again. I think it was not until later that next night. People were calling, small towns, it was the headline on the front page that morning, "Pedestrian killed on XX road." I know because my boyfriend at the time and I ran out and bought the paper at dawn. Papers. I still have mine. People kept coming over bringing food, crying, needing comfort. The janitor from my former high school was the first person to call with condolences. Dad was very loved. We were very numb. Mom was melting. I had to step up. I finally had enough and went to bed. Everyone else remained talking downstairs. Mom was still up, so were siblings 2 to 4. I decided to go lie down in Mom and Dad's bed, on his side of the bed, and buried my face in his pillow. It still smelled like him. Lying flat on my stomach, I silently cried myself to sleep in the darkness. He's been dead now for about 24 hours. How is that possible? At some point I was awakened by someone sitting on the bed, stroking my hair. It was a real, genuine sensory touch, comforting, loving. I felt it from a dead, exhausted sleep state, no mistaking it. So real that when it woke me up, I reached up expecting to touch my mum's hand. Empty space. "Mom?" I said as I rolled over. Silence. "Mom, is that you?" Electric stillness. I reached out from the bed and waved my arm back and forth in the darkness. Nothing. No one. I sat up. "Mom?" Dead silence. Dead darkness. I got up, ran out of the room, and sprang to the top of the stairs. "Mom?" "Yes," she replied. "Were you just up here in your room trying to wake me up?" Pin drop. "No, honey," she said softly. "I just felt you rubbing my hair," I implored, almost begging. Pause. "It wasn't me, sweetheart," she said flatly. But it had been so real, it woke me up. I ran all the way down the stairs and just looked at her. We just stared. Tears started to well up in her eyes, then in mine too. We didn't say another word, we didn't have to. I turned away, staring at the floor, and just whispered to myself, "I love you too, Dad." My house was built in the 1950s, but the land had been in my family since before the Civil War. There was a farmhouse there before the war which was burnt down. I live in the southern United States. So my house wasn't old, but the land and the history sure was. My ancestors were white farmers who helped run escaped slaves up north before and during the war. We've always been proud of our civil rights involvement. My grandmother marched in several demonstrations in the 60s. This is all just background info. Let's get to the apparitions. My great aunt was as sensitive, as was my great grandmother, and my mom, though mom wasn't as sensitive as the other women in the family. I got my sensitivity from these incredible women. I'm not psychic, I'm not esoteric. I can only tell you what I experienced growing up. My house was a 2-story with an attic and basement. It was a big house with so many rooms. My first memory of the paranormal was when I was in kindergarten. I was walking upstairs to my room when I heard an old radio show playing from another upstairs bedroom. Our guest rooms had old radios and TVs that didn't work, but looked very vintage and cool. I sat down and listened, laughing at the jokes. When I rose back up and took one step up, the sound stopped. So I went back to the step I sat on and heard it again. When I stepped down to the next step, it was silent. I could only hear it from that step. I didn't always hear the radio when I stood on that step, but that step is the only place I heard it. There was a ghost I would play with on those steps too. A little boy in brown short pants with brown shoes and a white button-up shirt. He would appear when I was going upstairs, hanging his legs through the banisters along the upstairs landing. He would laugh and wave. Sometimes he would get up and run. My mom played with the same child ghost when she was little. Sometimes, when I was in my room sleeping, the sounds of a small party of people would wake me up. It was coming from the room where I thought the radio I heard on the steps would play. I would listen to people laughing, hear them moving around, smell cigarettes even though no one in my house smoked. I would get fed up after a while and stick my head out the door. I would ask them to keep it down. I had school the next day. The ghosts would go silent after that. I would see a tall, sad black woman in my basement. She wore a long, simple brown skirt with a reddish-pink skirt. She wore a white scarf on her head. Sometimes she would be weeping in the corner. I asked my great-grandmother about that corner, and she told me that the old house had a hidden tunnel that my ancestors would hide slaves in. While our house wasn't in the same location as the old house, the tunnel ran right through the spot where we would eventually have our basement. My father painted a Mona Lisa, the first thing that everyone notices when they come at my home. It's a big picture that is sometimes in the living room, sometimes the dining room. At the moment it can be found on the wall in front of the large rustic wooden table on which we eat our meals. My father paints very well, but his Mona Lisa was not so much like the original. Her skin is darker, her clothes are completely black, and the background is green with yellow, illustrated with random drawings and phrases in Italian. However, there is something that he managed to reproduce perfectly, something that in my opinion is the essence of the painting. The eyes. They seem to stare at you as if you know all your secrets. There's kind of a legend about the original Mona Lisa, which says no matter where you are, she always looks at you, and I can attest that, in fact, it is true. Or at least it is here at home. No matter where or from what angle you look, she always seems to look you in the eye. The main reason why people show fear of the painting when they visit us. I confess, I almost feel a little afraid of it. My mother is also afraid, my aunts, my uncles. In short, everyone who has seen it. Why don't we get rid of it? Well, to start with, my father would never let us. After all, he was the one who painted it, and besides, we kind of got used to it. It doesn't bother us so much, so there's no reason to get rid of it. Once, something strange happened, related to the Mona Lisa, here at home. I remember it well, despite being around 8 years old at the time, because it was something that marked me a lot. Whenever we were going to travel for a few days, my aunt would keep a copy of the key to our old apartment. She lived in the apartment below, in order to feed our fish, or the poor fish would be dead by the time we returned. The aquarium was in the guest's bathroom, for some reason I don't remember why, and to get to the bathroom it was necessary to pass in front of the living room wall where the painting was. My aunt hated doing this, because she was terrified of the Mona Lisa, and claimed that the painting always looked at her whenever she passed by. One day she told me that, and I was slightly scared. I don't really remember if my father and I had left the apartment and gone up to ours, while my mother had stayed there talking to her. I just know that we were both in the kitchen, and I was afraid to pass in front of the painting. before entering my dad's TV room / workroom. He said it was silly and went there, no matter how much I protested. I stayed at the kitchen door while he passed in front of the Mona Lisa, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes, in which the black irises always rest on the right side, close in the corner, were moving to the left, following the rhythm of my father's steps. And as soon as he passed through the door, they quickly returned to their place of origin, as if they had never left there. Of course, I screamed desperately, stating that the Mona Lisa's eyes moved, but I didn't believe it for 1 second. The only thing I remember after that was telling my mother what had happened and hearing from her mouth that she too had already seen the painting's eyes moving that way. After that day, I never saw it happen again, and if it weren't my aunt and my mother witnessing it, I would have thought it was just my imagination. Back in 2015, my freshman year in college, my older sister and I became roommates and moved into a new home that she had bought. It was a nice home, fairly large for just 2 people. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 living rooms, laundry room, dining room and kitchen. Now my sister is about 12 years my senior, so I found it odd that she would want me as her roommate. Being that she was in her early 30s and in a much more settled time in her life, and I was the typical college party animal staying up late, coming home at random hours of the night with the occasional guest. We were total opposites. However, she told me I wouldn't have to pay rent or bills if I moved in, so who was I to say no? Plus it beat living at the dorms at my university. Upon moving in, it only took a while to get a clue as to why she wanted a roommate so bad. As nice as a house that was, that home had some creepy and uneasy vibes to it that I picked up on fairly quickly. Maybe it was the fact that the place felt big for just 2 people, but almost immediately, I felt like I was never alone in that house. Like something was always watching me. But I never expressed these feelings to my sister. Not right away, anyway. The first few things I started witnessing were the moving dining room chairs. My sister had this set of dining room chairs that were relatively heavy for what they were. Like you actually had to apply some force to move the things in and out of wherever you were going to sit. And because they had some weight to them, they made a very distinct sound whenever you scrapped the wooden legs against the floor when pulling the chair in and out. One day I was in the TV room watching Netflix. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening and I was home alone. That particular day had been a lazy one, nothing lounging around for me. I'd watched Netflix for so long that I was no longer paying attention to the TV, but was rather fixated on my phone, scrolling through social media while the TV played in the background. So I was much more aware of the background noise than I would have been if I'd been focusing on the TV. I was scrolling through Instagram and suddenly I heard a quick of the dining room chair being dragged. My eyes immediately focused towards the entrance of the TV room. Surely I was hearing things, right? I thought maybe my sister had gone home and had sat down without hearing her come in. But then again, this wasn't possible, as she'd told me that she'd be at work at this time. I got up to go check who was in our home, but almost immediately I heard a much longer and louder smack. This one was the one that made my hair stand up and caused my heart to start beating fast. The first sound sounded as if someone had bumped into the chair. The chair had to have been dragged in order to make that second sound. Although my heart was racing, I can honestly say that I was about 20% scared, 80% intrigued. I opened the TV room door and peeked around the corner of the wall that allows me to see out the room, through the kitchen and partially into the dining room. Fuck me! The farthest dining room chair was leaning up against the wall in the back of the room. Someone or something had dragged the chair out and bumped it into the wall, which explains the smack I'd heard after the second sound. I stared out into the dining room for about a minute and had goosebumps almost throughout that time. I decided that I would not leave that TV room until my sister came home, so I turned around, locked the door, and got back under the blanket I'd taken with me. However, the chairs did not stop creaking, and I could clearly hear them moving around from time to time for the entire 2 hours that I waited for her to get home. That was the first paranormal activity, if that's what you want to call it, that I'd ever experienced, not just at home, but ever. I didn't tell my sister for some odd reason that I don't understand looking back, but those chairs moving would go on to become the norm for me. I'd be in any room and I could hear them move. I'd somehow accepted the fact that something is moving those chairs, but never really feared the fact that it was happening. And so life in our home kept going. A couple months went by with the typical chair activity, when one night I got woken up by a voice calling out to me. I still remember the sound of that voice till this very day, and I'm getting chills just reminiscing about it in order to write about it for you guys. The day this happened to me was on the final day of final exams for the fall semester, so the previous night I had spent pulling an all-nighter for the final 2 exams that I had on that day. I got home and from school around 3 p.m, opened my closet, which was on the left-hand side of my bed, threw my backpack in there and collapsed onto my bed. I was out almost immediately. Now, I'm someone that never sleeps with my closet doors open. I've always found it creepy since I was a kid from all the scary stories, so I just grew up that way. I was so tired from my all-nighter that day, that I guess I didn't think about the doors being open when I fell asleep. Fast forward, it's now late at night. I'd slept through the whole day and was still in a heavy sleep. I was in my heavy state of sleep when I suddenly heard a very stern whisper say, "Hey." That woke me up. I remember sitting up in a sit-up type manner on my bed and looking at my left, and that's where I heard the whisper come from. I look over to my closet and it's pitch black compared to the rest of my room, and I noticed that the door wasn't closed. I wasn't spooked at all at first. I was sitting up in bed, looking around my closet and the rest of the room. I finally decided that I must have heard the voice in my dream. I'm just going to go back to bed. I lay back down, rested my head on the pillow, and immediately upon closing my eyes again to go back to bed, I heard it again. Only this time wasn't much of a whisper. "Hey," it called out to me from the direction of my closet. I shot out of bed and turned on my lights. This time I knew I wasn't dreaming voices. I had physically woken up and sat up in bed. I'd looked around. I wasn't asleep. This voice was very real and it was trying to make contact with me. I looked at my phone and the time was 4 a.m. I finally mustered the courage to close my closet door and I eventually dozed back off to sleep. But that voice still lingers in my memory from time to time, and it's made me into a believer that the paranormal is in fact real.